Welcome to the Ultimate Beginner Quilt Series by Fat Quarter Shop. In this series, I'm going to be showing you how to make a quilt all the way from the start to the finish. This series is sponsored by Moda Fabrics and Eversewn Sewing Machines. I'm going to be giving you lots of tips, and we're going to be building our first quilt together. In this video, we'll be making block 7, which is our Flying Geese ZigZag block. It is going to be the most difficult block in the whole series, but I've got lots of tips and tricks for you, and I know that you've got the confidence to do this. So let's get started. So we're going to be using 4 fabrics, and from each of the fabrics, we're going to be cutting identical pieces. So from each of the fabrics, we're going to cut 2 3.5 by 6.5 inch rectangles and 4 3.5 inch squares. They're all going to be labeled between A and H, and the reason we do that is so that it's easy for you to follow your pattern. So let's start cutting. So we have 4 fabrics left, and this one we don't have very much of, so I'm going to cut this one completely separate. But the others, these 2 I have a long enough strip, and this one's kind of wonky. So I'm going to set the brown and the pink aside, and we're going to cut those separately. From these 2 fabrics, we're going to cut 2 3.5 inch strips. So I've done a clearing cut that's just going to straighten the edges. I'm going to cut on the 3.5 inch line. Pull my fabric gently, and I'm going to cut another 3.5 inch strip. Just follow the line. If you're cutting and you cut like this, which is not on the 3.5, your units will be too small. So cutting is really important. So we will pull this. We're going to cut 2 6.5 inch rectangles. So we can actually cut on one side to get a clean cut. Rotate your fabrics, and when you're moving your fabrics, you want to keep the bottom and the top fabrics together. And we can label these with our alphabets at the very end. So we're going to cut a 6.5 inch rectangle, another 6.5 inch rectangle. Put these on my design board. We'll label them later. And we're going to cut 4 3.5 inch squares. So I can cut a 3.5 from this that's left over. This is too small to cut from, so I'm going to set that aside. Put this on my design board, and we have 3 more 3.5 inch squares to cut. So you just line up the top and the side. And then you can save this leftover strip for a future block. Put these on our design board. And I'm going to start with the brown. I'm going to just cut 2 3.5 inch strips. And I think I will need one more still. I think I'm going to need a little bit more. But let me first cut 6.5 inch rectangles. So from here, you can line up your fabrics and put them together, make sure they're straight. Make a straightening cut on one side. Rotate your fabrics. And cut a 6.5 inch square rectangle, 6.5 inch rectangle. There's 2 of those. And now we're going to cut 4 3.5 inch squares. So there's 2, but we need 2 more. So we're going to put these aside. And we're going to look and see if this is 7 inches wide, because 3.5 plus 3.5 is 7. So I can get 2 across here. So I'm going to cut this way instead of long way so that we have a big piece if we need that in the future. So we've got 3.5. And we barely have 7 inches, so we're just going to cut a skinny straightening line. Rotate and cut 2 more 3.5 inch. So we have 3 of our fabrics cut, and it's okay to cut. You could cut all 4 individually if you wanted to. So now we have our smallest piece, which is the pink, and you can sit and you can think through all the measurements, or I like to cheat. That's why I cut the easiest ones first. So anytime I'm doing something, I usually do the easiest first and move to the hardest. So you can take pieces you just cut and think through how you think it would be best to cut them. So you can do it this way or this way, but now we know that it fits. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut 4 strips that are 3.5 and then subcut. Or you could just do the math in your head. You can do it any way you want, but I think that is the easiest way. You don't have to think as much and it's quicker. So we're going to cut 4 3.5 inch strips to start. And as you move on in your quilt, your pieces are going to get smaller and smaller because we've been using them throughout. And so if you just cut your biggest piece first and go down to your smallest, it will be really easy. So what I think I'll do first is cut 2 6.5 inch rectangles, and I'm going to show you a shortcut. Now you're a beginner. If you're a beginner, I don't know if I would try this, but it is something that can save time. So you have got your 6.5 inch ruler. What you could do is cut on one side, and instead of rotating it, cut backwards. But I would only recommend that if you have a lot of experience, but that can save you time. So there are my rectangles. And now we're going to cut squares. So I'm just going to line these up. Do a straightening cut. Rotate and cut 2 3.5 inch squares. And since we have 2 layered, that's going to give us our 4. So again, from 4 fabrics, we cut 2 3.5 inch rectangles from each and 4 3.5 inch squares from each. So now we're going to take our design board, put our pattern next to it, and we'll divide our fabrics out. So from A is going to be brown rectangles, B, brown squares, C will be your coral rectangles, and D will be your coral squares. And so you can see as your blocks get harder how the alphabeties really come into play, whereas maybe in some of the blocks it didn't make sense, but now it's going to really start making sense while we use these. Our E's are going to be our pink rectangles. Our F's are our pink squares. G is going to be your lime rectangles. And H will be your squares. So we have this all ready to go, and then we're going to move on to piecing. So your first step that will save you time is if on all of your squares, if you draw a line on the wrong side of each square. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now if you're working with a print fabric, just make sure you're on the wrong side. Since we're working with solids, there really isn't a wrong or right side. I'd like to use this friction pen. The ink will disappear with heat later. There are lots of marking tools you can use, so just use whichever one that you prefer, but my favorite is the friction pen. The first step is to make 2 flying geese that have fabric A and fabric D. So I'm going to pull these out, and then I can move these up out of my way. And we're going to put 1 square on the top. You will have a point in the middle and a point in the side. And we're going to do 2 just like this. First we're going to pin them, and I'm going to pin where you don't go inside any of the lines. Okay, so now we're going to start with this one. We're going to go to our sewing machine, put an open toe foot, and stitch directly on these 2 lines. So we're going to start with leaders, which is something we talked about in one of our previous videos. It just gets your thread going. And from here you can start at this point or at this point. I think it's easier to start from this inside point. It really doesn't matter though. And you're just going to stitch directly on that line. And if your fabric moves, you're just going to want to move it a little bit. You want to end right at that point. And we're going to do the same thing over here. we're going to use an ender, and we're going to use leaders and enders on this one since we're doing a lot of starting and stopping. And now we're going to go back to our cutting table. So you're going to set your seam. Setting your seam just means putting a little bit of pressure on your seams. It's going to lock those stitches in with your fabric. Now throughout this pattern, you're going to want to pay attention to your pressing arrows. On this Flying Geese, you press out towards the outside. So I'm going to finger press that, put my iron right on this edge. It's nice and flat. Do the same thing on the second one. And then we're going to add the other side of our Flying Geese to finish it off. So we'll place these, and you'll see that there's an intersection right in the center. And again, I'm going to pin, and we will go to our sewing machine and stitch this line on both of our units. Before you sew this second line, just make sure that you've got 2 points on the outside and 1 point on the inside. When you're sewing your second one, it's easier to start on this outside point rather than the inside point, because the inside point is going to have more bulk. So that's why I'm starting on the outside this time. Now we can go press. Before we press, we need to trim again 1/4 inch away from your stitched line. You can also use just big scissors. It's totally up to you on what you use, or you can use a rotary cutter, but scissors sometimes can save time. So we're going to press those flat. Press according to your pattern, and on this one we're going to go again to the pink. So now you have 2 Flying Geese, and you can take a ruler and check to make sure your point is 1/4 inch away. And if it is, that's great. And if it's not, what you want to do is when you're placing your square on your rectangle, you really need to start your intersection in each corner. So you'll start exactly in that corner and exactly in that corner. And so if you're sewing a little bit to the left or the little bit to the right of that intersection, that is what's going to be getting you a little bit off. You've made your first 2 Flying Geese, and we're going to make 6 more. You're going to follow your pattern closely, but what I like to do to save time is, okay, the C and the B are going to go together, so I'm going to pin these. So I've got those ready to go at the sewing machine table. And then you're going to move these. And your E and your H's are going to go together. So we're going to go ahead and get these pinned. And your G and your F's are going to go together. And so at this point, you can kind of chain piece them all together. So now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch down all of these lines, and then we're going to come back and press. And if you're having inaccuracies with your 1/4 inch not being away from your point, you just want to make sure right here you start right at the point. And when you get to the end, you sew directly to the point, and all of these fabrics are lined up right in the corner. So I'm looking at this one and it's not lined up exactly, so I'm going to repin this so that it's more in position. And now we're going to cut all of our pieces apart and go to our ironing table. So we're going to again trim approximately a 1/4 inch away. Again, you can use your rotary cutter or your scissors. I kind of do it either way in my sewing room. Sometimes I use my scissors, sometimes I use my rotary cutter. I don't really have one way that I prefer. I just do it whichever way is most convenient at the time. So get all of these off. And what we're going to do is on all of your brown and coral, you'll be pressing toward the outside. So we're going to press this one the same way we did our previous step. And put those on our design board. Now the pink and the lime, we're going to press the opposite way so that our seams nest. So we're going to press those toward the inside, which can be more complicated. It's harder because you're pressing towards a bigger piece. So I like to really finger press that down. And so you're going to do these towards the inside on the pinks and greens. And this, I'm going to show you one way to not do it. I'm going to show it to you. Let's just assume that you don't finger press and you just iron and you don't use the corner to smooth that in and you just press down. You're going to have a duck pleat, and that duck pleat means that there's gathers right there. And so you're going to see a crease. If you stitch on that, you're going to have a big crease in your quilt. So you want to not do that. Okay, so we've got them all pressed. We're going to bring our design board back. And we're going to add the last square. And again, you're going to have 1 point on the outside and 1 point on the inside. And if you need to, if you're a beginner and you really need to see, you can just kind of flip that back and you can see that that is a flying geese. So that if you did it this way and you flipped it back, that is not a flying geese. So you can always feel free to kind of flip it before you sew it, because it's easier to fix it now than to unpick it or seam rip it. Okay, so we're just gonna pin the rest of these. And just remember, this one is your hardest block yet. So if you get frustrated, just walk away, have a little snack, take a little nap, and then come back and keep going. And it's okay, especially when you're a beginner, if you get frustrated, that's okay. I think the best thing to do is just take a little break and then come back to it. And with quilting, it's just like anything else. Experience really helps you with it. So when you start, it's hard for everybody, but as you get used to it, it kind of just becomes muscle memory, and you just know exactly what to do. It's just like driving a car. When you get in a car and you're 16 years old, you have no idea what to do. You have to really think, oh, I've got to turn the engine on, I've got to back up. And now that when you're an adult, you're just like, oh, that's just how you drive a car. You don't even have to think about it. So quilting is kind of like that. As you get the hang of it, you'll just be not even having to think. It'll just come to you instinctively. Okay, so now we've got all of this pinned, and we're going to go sew again the final seams to our flying geese. Okay, so I'm going to show you one that is how to not do it. So if you have this lined up too far over here, when you pull this back, you're not going to have a 1/4 inch, you're going to have 1/8 of an inch. If you pull this too far this way, you're going to have a big old green spot hanging over. So you really just want this to intersect right on the very edge. So now that I moved that around, I'm going to pin it back. And if you sew too far this way or too far this way, it's going to make this not be a 90-degree angle. If you think you've sewn off in a direction, it's easier to go ahead and unstitch it and restitch it now before you trim that 1/4 inch off. Because once you get the 1/4 inch off, it's harder to line up the edges. You can't really, there's not a spot to go back to. Cut my leader off and use it as my ender. Cut these apart and we will go press and have 8 flying geese. So when you're using scissors, you'll want to have long blades and you'll want to use fabric scissors, not paper scissors. And don't let your kids touch these scissors, because then they're going to become dull and it's going to be harder to get that cut. So we're going to go back, and again, our brown and coral we're going to press out. Set your seam, finger press, and then put the very edge of your iron right on that seam. And on the pink and lime, we're going to press toward the inside, which again, now you're going to have much bulkier because now you've got an intersection to go towards. Two seams intersection. So you're just going to really flatten that out before you press down. So now you have these all done. You can check your intersection. If your intersection is too fat, you could trim it slightly with the rotary cutter. And if it's too small, I would probably redo it. So I'm just making sure that my 1/4 inch hits right there. And flying geese can be very hard if you're a beginner. So if they're not perfect the first time, they're going to get better. Just like driving, you're going to get better as you go. So I just don't want you to get frustrated on this block because it can be very complicated. So now I have 8 flying geese, and I'm going to kind of put the colors together. So we've got brown in the center first, coral in the center, and then I've got pink in the center going the opposite direction, and green in the center going the opposite direction. So you can see in this row we have 4 different flying geese. And going the other way, we're going to have pink in the center, lime in the center, and I can see right here, looky there. Look at that. That is horrible ironing right there. You see that duck pleat? Gotta fix that. I would cry if that was in my quilt. So you just fix that. Press that down. Oh no. Green in the center, brown in the center, and coral in the center. So I kind of, when you get to something that has 2 colors, just pick which, do you want to be looking at the inside or the outside? So I'm going to triple check this just against my pattern and see if I've got the points and the colors going the right way. And of course, honestly, if you make a mistake, nobody's going to really see, but what it's doing here is it's making this kind of like an arrow and an arrow, an arrow, and an arrow. So that's kind of the artwork we're doing. So I'm going to turn this direction because I think it's easier to pin this direction. I think it'll be easier to sew down this line. So I'm going to put all of these right side together. This is when you see the design board is absolutely necessary. So when you're working on some of the easier blocks, you might have thought, well, why is she using that design board? She doesn't need it. Well, now you're going to see you really do. So I'm going to pin always first on the section that doesn't have an intersection. And then I'm going to pin, and I'm going to basically, you start just like this, just anywhere. And you just put your fingers and you just push into the seams into each other and they just nest. And you should be able to feel it. So again, when you're pinning this intersection, you don't want to pin like this because that's not straight. So you got to be right on that edge. And so pinning really does help on accuracy. Sometimes people think, oh, I don't want to pin because it's too much time. Well, then you're going to have to seam rip. Okay, so we've got that right there, and just put it right back on your design board where it was. So again, on this one, I'm going to first go to the intersection. That's easy. Finger press this down, and you'll feel it lock. You'll feel it lock. Even if you press open on all of these, you can feel it lock. And that's kind of something that you'll just get used to. Okay, so here, you're gonna just lock it in. And then we're gonna go to our sewing machine. We're gonna change our foot to a 1/4 inch foot, and we're gonna stitch all the way down. And do not cut your threads when you're done, because you're going to keep that chain together, so when you come back you don't have to relay it back out because it's all chained together. So I like to keep the pin in until I get right to it. Okay, now here, before we go to the ironing board, I'm going to open all of my seams and make sure that the intersection is nice. And if any of them are not nice, I'm going to redo them. And if you don't want to redo them, you don't have to. It's totally personal preference. There we go. Okay, so now you can see it's all chained together. And if you didn't do it that way, then just take your time and lay everything back out. And we're going to just press opposing directions. I'm going to press this one this direction, this one the other direction. And you're going to notice that I did my piecing a slightly different than the pattern, and that's okay. You're going to get the same result, and you basically just want to press everything a different direction. And I kind of just did it my way just to show you that when you're quilting, you can do it however you want. You can go a little bit off script and everything will be okay. So now I'm going to just press. And you notice when I'm pressing these intersections, I'm not pressing the whole thing. I'm just kind of pressing that one intersection. And whether you assemble the block the way I did or way the pattern is, it really doesn't matter. You're going to get the same result. So now I'm going to put this on my design board, and I'm going to show you a little trick, which is to save you time. Now it's all connected, right? So what you can do is you can press those, you can stitch those and these at the same time. Stop, press, and then do your center at the end. So it's kind of a little trick to save time. So the first thing we're going to do is put these right side together, and we're going to nest this seam. You're just going to make sure you feel it nest. I am going to do 2 pins. If there's a lot of bulk, I will do 2 pins. If there's just a little bit of an intersection, I will just do it once. And on the side, you just get the corners together. You don't have to nest anything. And I'm going to also pin right here. Now this is a 1/4 inch seam right here, so if you pin too far up or too far down, that's going to affect the accuracy. So just pin right in the center so that you make sure your fabrics are lined up together. Pin at the end. And the same thing here is there's an intersection here, so you want to make sure that these are lined up right there. And we can turn our board around and we can go ahead and iron this side, or we can go ahead and pin this side. So just make sure your seams nest, pin on each side. And you've got a lot of bulk there, so sometimes when you pin it might be a little bit harder. Pin on the intersection of the end. In the center. So we've got 2 sides pinned, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch here, stop, stitch here, and then we're going to come back and iron, and we'll only have 1 seam left. So thanks for hanging in there with me. So I'm going to sew on the side where I can see the little intersection so that you can kind of sew and see where you're sewing so you don't go too high or too low. So let's just start stitching. And so when you're sewing, you can just be a little bit to the right of that, or you can just sew and hope it comes out best. But I think you can just see, and you're just going right to the right of that. And you're just gonna keep sewing. Okay, now you can see on this one, we're not going to be able to see that intersection because of the way we press, so we're just going to hope that that one works. But when you're sewing, you want to make sure that you don't sew it back this way. You want to keep it this way. And it's going to be pretty bulky. So you're just going to go a little bit slower when you get to it. And you want to keep it nice and flat. And you're just going to hope that your seam works. So now we're going to go and do the other side first, and then we'll come back and check our seams. So again, you could stitch on this side or this side, but I want to stitch on this side so I can sew right to the edge of that. And I'm kind of putting my finger over it so that it keeps that fabric flat, so that when it goes under the presser foot, it stays flat. And then I can move it, and you can just move your fabric slightly. And this seam is really bulky, so sometimes you have to slow down when you get to it, because it kind of, sometimes your foot will. And again here. I'm just keeping my finger right on there to keep it flat, to go flatly through the machine. We're going to end with an ender, and then we are going to look and see what we need to adjust, if we need to adjust anything. I would assume we probably do, since this is a more difficult block. So that is nice and perfect. 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 Woohoo! Let's check my other ones. So I'm going to look at my other side, and I've got everything is sewn correctly. And let's pretend that this one isn't. If it's not, you would come back and you could seam rip from here to here, repin, and restitch. And when you restitch, you'll want to stitch on top of previous stitches. But you want to get it right before we go iron, and now we can go iron. Okay, so we're going to flatten those seams, and you're just going to press to one side. You've got a lot of bulk, so you want to get it nice and flat. And I don't want you to get discouraged if when you stitch your seams don't line up perfectly. I've been sewing for 25 years, so I actually just got lucky there. So don't get frustrated. This iron's a little hot. Okay, so now we're going to put this together. Now this is where it's going to get tricky, because you can see there's a point and a point, and all four of these points are going to have to match. So I'm actually going to cut this apart, flip it together, and show you what I do. So I'm going to turn this right side together. Right where there is an intersection right there, I'm going to put my pin in. I'm gonna look and that pin comes right at that point. And then I'm gonna put the pin in the next point. I'm going to kind of keep my seam straight up and down, leave that pin in, pin to the left and the right, so it keeps it flat. And that is going to be a lot of bulk. That's going to be the most bulk you have in the entire quilt. Now you can remove this. We'll pin on each end, and now these seams need to nest. So you're going to put your finger there, and you won't have an intersection here on these. This time you won't have an intersection here, you're just going to have it here. So you will nest these seams, and then we've just got one seam left to do in the hardest block of the whole quilt. You're almost done. And here when you're stitching, you just want to make sure you keep your fabrics lined up, that they don't get off balance. If they do, you can always put your finger underneath and pull it back. And now you're getting to this intersection, so it's going to get kind of bulky. You're just going to go slow. And you can see where that intersection is, so you can be a little bit to the right of it. But with all of that bulk right there, sometimes it's hard to see. And I can see right now my green is poking out right there, and I don't want that to poke out, so I'm going to pull it from the bottom to get it straighter and just keep going. And then we're going to check our seams. And we're going to see how it looks. Let's see. Fingers crossed. So that intersection looks nice. That one looks perfect, so my polka pin worked. And my edge looks perfect, so all we've got to do is iron. So now we're going to set our seam. And this, you're going to have a lot of bulk. So you can see how if you started ironing, you've got a big thing right there. You've got to really press it down. And put your edge of your iron right on that center. And the block came out really nice. I really like it. And we're gonna just trim the slivers off next. So to trim this block up, it's gonna be a little bit trickier than the others because you've got a lot of seams on the edge, but this is when I really like to trim it up. So you're just really turning the slivers off. I'm gonna line my ruler on the side, and I'm gonna line up all three 1/4 inch away and trim. And this one, you're going to see a little bit more fabric comes off because there's a lot of seams. We're going to turn it, and on this one, we're going to line it up with 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, and the top. So we're going to line this up at the top, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch. And I can see on this corner, right here, it's not an exact 90 degree. So I'm going to trim a little bit more off. And you don't have to be that particular. You really don't have to be. I just happen to be. So again, line up the bottom and these two, and I can tell I'm a little bit off here too, but I've got the 2 1/4 inch seams. And then here, we're going to line up the 1/4 inch with the 3 intersections. I'm going to trim. So this is our beautiful block 7, and now you can really see those arrows I was talking about. So you can see the lime arrow, coral arrow, pink arrow, and brown arrow, and how it gives you a beautiful design. I can't wait to see all of your block 7s. I hope this block really gives you the confidence to try a hard block in the future. I would love for you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I'll see you next week for block 8.